All right, next we want to build the touch sensor assembly for the front of the robot. I'm going to show you what we're going to build. We just built 2 of these, one on either side. So this is the touch sensor. And when you're doing this layout, you want to make sure that the beam is on top. The beam is on top and the little red touch sensor is in the front. And what we're basically doing is building this construct that's on the side that allows us to have a beam to press the touch sensor. The instructions have a much more elaborate construction, but it uses a part or parts that we don't have in our kit. And so we're going to have to do a little bit of experimentation to get the touch sensors to work exactly the way we want. And this is as much as we're actually going to build at this point in time. All right, so I'm going to set this one aside and I'll talk you through the process with the other side. So again, these are going to be symmetrical. So this is going to look like the other one, but the opposite. I'm going to start with a long blue peg, and I'm going to put it through from this side. And then I'm going to take one of the little half pegs slash axles, because the middle part of the beam on the top of the sensor is an axle connector. And we're going to stick that in so that they are both on the same side. And on the other side, we're going to add another long blue connector, but we're going to do something different here than you might have seen before. We're going to stick the short end into the beam so that the long end sticks out 2 beam heights instead of just 1. So it should look something like this when you're all ready. And then we'll add a black peg to, no, we don't add the black peg yet. We add the black peg at the next step. All right, so then we're going to take one of these blue 3 long beams and slide it onto the long beam and the short beam so that it sits just right there. Now we add a black peg in the middle so that we still have 2 pegs right here. The next step is to take one of these parts. It's a 3 long unit, and the last unit is twisted 90 degrees and is an axle rather than a hole. And what we want is this axle channel to be running vertically, because we're going to run an axle down to attach our little swingy arm. So these 2 holes go into the 2 pegs that we've got. So notice this is not aligned exactly with the other ones. It's 1 step forward. All right, so now we have an axle that's vertical. We're going to take a 5 long axle, and we're just going to slide it into this axle channel. You can be a little bit imprecise about how far up it goes. I think that's a little further than I want, but it should look something like this. All right, so then we're going to space out the swinging arm, which is one of these 3x5 L-shaped beams. And we're going to use these things. I always call these full stop bushings, but they may have changed the name. In any case, it's just a little tube that's an axle shape. Notice that the 2 ends are different. Pay attention to that. I always try to follow the pictures exactly, because sometimes that actually makes a difference in how much friction and how locking effect and so forth. So in this case, I'm going to put the round end on first and just slide it all the way up. And then I'm going to take the last hole of the short end of my L beam and slide it onto the axle. And then notice that it will swing, that's fine. And I'll use 1 more of these bushings to lock it in place. All right, that's it. Now, if we can get something that presses on the beam, that will trigger the touch sensor. Okay, the next step is to build a construct to hold 2 more sensors. This is the ultrasonic sensor. That means it's basically sonar. It sends out a pulse of sound and gets distance measurement back. And this is the other sensor. Notice the little symbol on top. This is a gyroscope sensor. I don't know that we're going to need this one, but we're going to go ahead and put it on. We can always take it off later if we decide we don't want it. So these 2 are going to basically hang off of a construct that we make out of 2 axles. And we're also attached to this construct the parts that allow us to attach this to the rest of the robot chassis. All right, so I'm going to set the sensors aside. We're going to start with the long axle. This is a 12 long axle. And then we have 3 parts. We have one of these that has the axle end and 2 holes, and the axle is turned 90 degrees. That's going to actually be our very end of the over here. We have one of these parts that's 3 long beam with an axle at 90 degrees, and that's going to go next. And then we have one of these. Now this part has 2 axles separated at the ends of the 3 long beam, and we're going to use that to space out our 2 axles that we're using here. This is the first piece I'm going to put on from this end, and I'm going to slide it down a little ways. And then I'm going to put this part on going the opposite direction so that the 3 beam is on the back compared to the other one that we've just added. And then this one just goes on the very end. Oops. I want this to be all the way at the end because we're going to need the whole length of this. All right, so it should look something like this when you've got it done. Now what we're going to do next is to add the other axle. It's slightly shorter. This is a 10 long axle. And we're going to slide it into the front of our black part, and then use one of these bushings to hold it in place. And it should look something like this. It's a little bit shorter, but that's okay. All right, the next step is to add the ultrasonic sensor. So this is the ultrasonic sensor. Notice it has a 3 long beam attached to it, and the 2 ends are what we're going to use. So we're just going to slide it on as it is. And then we're going to take another of these black pieces that has that's 3 long and it has 2 axle ends on it, and we're going to slide that on afterwards to lock the gyroscope in place. I found when I did this that it took a little bit of wiggling to avoid shoving the axles out of position because this is pretty tight. And that's actually a good thing in long term because we want this to be fixed in place and not move around a lot. All right, after this we need to add another of these pieces. This is going to be how we connect this to the whole robot, and a spacer on the front. I'm moving some other parts up here as we go forward. So this is going to go on the back axle, and we want it to look just like the other one. It should be the same orientation as the one that we added before. So it looks like that. And then we'll just put one of these bushings on the front to hold the position to match this part right here. Okay. We're going to add another one of these vertical pieces. So this is kind of making something that's parallel and that's in structure. We want it to hang down, and we put this on the back. So now if you look at it from the back, it should look like this. And we need another bushing in the front just to block that space, so that when we add something to both, it'll work out. We're going to add one more piece here. It's one of these strange triangular guys. Actually, no, we're putting the bushings on first. I should look at the directions before I do this. Bushing goes on first, one on either one of the axles, and then this part goes on. This is in some ways just a spacer, spacing out so that when we add the gyroscope sensor, it's in the right place. Okay, so the next step is to add the gyroscope sensor. Make sure that, that the blank end is in the front, not the end that has the jack where we're going to plug the sensor in. And that just slides on like this. And we're almost done with this beam. We're going to have one more of these black pieces to lock the gyroscopic sensor in place. And then the very last step, I always think of these as shoes, but Lego says this is a pointer. We're going to add this to cap off the end of our unit. So now we have these two axles and both sensors are hanging off of it, and we have these other connectors there to help us connect this to the whole robot. There are two last steps that we're going to do, and that's to set up pegs to connect this to the rest of the robot. So in the middle of each of these three gray parts, we'll put a black peg. That didn't work. Try it again. Pointing down. And then in these vertical parts, not the bottommost ring, but the one just up from that, we're going to put, oh, and this is where this gets tricky. We're going to put one of these red pegs in from the front. And this is tricky. It would actually have been way easier to do this before we added the sensors. I don't know why the instructions say to do it this way. You can do it. It's a little bit tricky, particularly this one, because we have to kind of reach in between the two sensors to do it. There we go. Well, after much fumbling, I managed to get these in place. The most frustrating thing is later on, we're going to have to push them back and then put them back in place again, which is all really exciting. But this is the final unit. And we're all set to add this to the robot when we get to that point.